This ZeroNow program is brought to you with the support of our founding partners.
I'm just one person.
Determined
to bring us back to zero.
I'm just one person.
Determined to bring us back to zero.
I am just one person.
Determined to bring us back to zero.
All right, good afternoon. I'm Ara Bagdasarian, the founder and board president of ZeroNow, and welcome to this ZeroNow Sessions on hazing prevention. Sessions is a forum to exchange big ideas and best practices for safer schools nationwide. ZeroNow is a stakeholder alliance formed to drive ideas, innovation, and investment to advance campus safety. As a member-based nonprofit, ZeroNow facilitates collaboration between industry, association, and education partners to foster new solutions that keep our schools safe and secure. Before we get started, we want to recognize our sponsors and founding partners who made this program possible. Thank you to Access Communications, Additional Corporation, Telos Corporation, OmniAlert, Johnson Controls, IACLEA, VTV Family Outreach Foundation, NASPA, Student Affairs Administrators in Higher Education, and Campus Safety Magazine and Conferences. If you're interested in learning more about becoming a member, please visit zeronow.org. We've got different information on there for your review. So now let's meet our panelists. First, we have Jessica Mertz. Jessica is the executive director of Clery Center, a national nonprofit dedicated to college and university campus safety. Jessica leads a team of experts in providing guidance to campus officials on how to meet standards of the Clery Act and to build effective prevention and response programs. Jessica is also a member of the ZeroNow Advisory Council. Welcome, Jessica.
Thanks, happy to be here.
Elizabeth Allen, welcome, Elizabeth. Elizabeth is a professor of higher education and program coordinator for the University of Maine. Allen's research focus on campus cultures and climates includes studies on classroom teaching, campus diversity, equity, as well as student hazing and its prevention. She has presented research about hazing to the U.S. Senate Help Committee and the U.S. Department of Defense and at national, international conferences, institutes, and workshops. Welcome, Elizabeth.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
And Hannah Lee. Hannah graduated from Washington State University with a BS in psychology in 2018 and currently lives in Denver, which she will graduate this June with a master's in higher education from the University of Denver, and is a graduate assistant for the Office of Student Engagement and Fraternity and Sorority Life. She will graduate intern in 2021 from Stop Hazing and is currently a member of the Student Network for Advocacy and Prevention SNAP group. Welcome, Hannah.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
All right, let's get started. Lots of questions, and welcome our attendees. And before we get started, I just want to remind our attendees, if you have questions, please click on the Q&A button, not the chat. You can still chat during the program, but please click on the Q&A, and you can type in your questions there, and we'll address those about halfway through the program. Now, first things first. Let's look at the prevalence of hazing. How prevalent is hazing on campuses? Elizabeth, would you like to start with that question?
Sure. Yeah. So the most comprehensive data that we have on that question is from the National Study of Student Hazing, which was back in 2008. And it looked at the nature and extent of student hazing on college campuses throughout the US, collecting data from more than 11,000 students at 52 different colleges and universities. And then that was, survey data. And then we also went to 22 of those campuses and did interviews and focus groups. So it was a very extensive study. And in that investigation, we learned that 55% of college students had experienced hazing, and that extended across a number of different types of clubs, teams, organizations, with athletics and fraternity sorority life being the types of groups where it was most prevalent. But I think many were surprised to find that students who were members of club sport teams, intramural sports, performing arts organizations like a cappella groups and marching bands, honor societies, and even academic clubs had experienced hazing. So So it's more widespread than many people had imagined prior to that.
I mean, is there a specific psychological profile for an organization or individual to be exposed to hazing?
Well, I don't know that we have the research yet to say there's a specific psychological profile. I think that it's very common when people first hear about the very horrific types of hazing that tend to make the headlines and the evening news. I mean, it's very common to feel like there must be a really, some kind of really criminal profile of these students involved, and in reality, many of these students, we found from our research, are students who are very well adjusted socially, meaning they have friends. It's not like they're desperate to become a member of an organization, will just do anything anyone asks them to do. They tend to be also getting good grades. So I think that it can happen to students who are doing well. And I think that's one thing that folks need to pay attention to, that this is something that the kind of behavior that is very unexpected and unanticipated, but happens quickly often, and people don't see the warning signs. And so while we don't have a psychological profile, I think that it's important to know it can affect or impact students who are at many different stages of their development and awareness about hazing.
To your point, Elizabeth, I mean, are there, Hannah or Jess, I mean, are there early warning signs? How do you identify that someone is involved in hazing? Are there any, clear signals?
I think it's so, in terms of like clear signals, I think a lot of times, no, there really isn't. And I think a lot of times with students have a hard time identifying when they're experiencing hazing related behaviors, because it could be something that is happening a lot and is so ingrained into just the culture of, whatever group they're a part of, and really might be something that's more psychological, emotional harm and damage, where I think if we look at, so there's like a spectrum of hazing. And so when behaviors are happening more frequently, they're oftentimes less visible. And so I think with that less visible behavior, it's a lot of that psychological, emotional experience. And so it's a lot harder to notice it. And so a lot of times we're not really aware of when it's happening. And I think paying attention to those early warning signs can be really difficult, because it can be so just disguised as all these different things. I don't know, Elizabeth or Jessica, if you have anything else to add on to that, but when I think of warning signs, I think sometimes why it's really hard to see, to notice them.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just going to say something really similar, that I think one of the biggest challenges is that people are often not identifying their experience as hazing and are not calling it hazing, right? So without that sort of shared understanding and that shared language, it makes it really difficult for even, people who are experiencing it to recognize it as such, but also the other people in their lives to recognize it as such. And I spent, prior to Clery Center, about 10 years at an institution myself. And it honestly wasn't until coming here and spending so much time better understanding this issue, separated from my day-to-day work on a campus and learning from Elizabeth and her team, that I started to reflect on so many of the times where students were experiencing hazing right in front of me, and I was still not identifying it as hazing or thinking about it as particularly harmful for them.
So, Elizabeth, how does one define hazing? Is there a universal explanation?
Well, there are a number of different ways in which it gets defined in policies, for example, institutional policies, legal language. We use a simple definition that's pretty typical, which is hazing is any activity expected of someone joining or participating in a group that is humiliating, degrading, dangerous, harmful, or has the potential to be abusive, and it can happen regardless of a person's willingness to participate. So we typically break it down to 3 key components because it's easier to remember that way. And we all found that because, like Jess was saying, it's still a pretty new, it's an issue that even though it's been going on for decades, more than decades, we're just now seeing increasing awareness on college campuses and the part of campus professionals. And so it's really important that we start with clarity around that definition. And I think there's a lot of confusion sometimes between, well, what's the difference between hazing and assault? What's the difference between hazing and bullying? And so we try to really zero in on those 3 key components. One is behavior that's occurring as part of a group situation, a group context, usually a joining process, but it doesn't have to be. It could be also for maintaining full membership and feeling, that you need to do this in order to maintain your status in the group. Secondly, that is a particular kind of behavior. It's not just anything. It's like, obviously groups can have membership expectations, and that's okay. That doesn't mean it's hazing, but we're talking about behavior that is abusive or has the potential for harm, emotional and or physical. And thirdly, that there's this consent component to it. We often hear people say, oh, no, that wasn't hazing because we gave them a choice of whether or not to do the activity, and they chose to do it. And this third component of hazing can happen regardless of a person's willingness to participate is part of the definitions, precisely because of that group context, because there's so much potential for peer pressure and a coercive environment when students are trying to gain membership and or be seen as a full member in good standing of a club, team, or organization. It really is, the power dynamics can be really problematic and interfere with a true consent.
So, Hannah, as a student, have you heard, I was, doing some research on this, the whole notion that, hazing it's group trauma that unites people through this group trauma. Is there any validity in that? Is that one of the motivating factors? And are there other motivating factors?
Yeah. I think that comes up a lot when you talk about, why people continue to do it. I think that people try to, justify and argue these positive benefits from it. And they're like, well, it creates a sense of belonging, and it makes people, it brings people closer together. And while that might be true in their experiences, and I think acknowledging the validity of that, there are so many other ways to provide that experience that keep students safe, that provide a much more healthy sense of belonging, and a much more sustainable one and less harmful. And so I think acknowledging that that might be actually a motivating factor for people. How do we shift and have them think about a different way, think about the potential outcomes that come from those experiences too. And you can still create a very healthy group sense of belonging through different behaviors that don't necessarily reinforce these power dynamics and don't look like hazing and are not hazing. And so I think that's something that, I think that there might be validity in that, but I think there's also validity in the harm that it creates. And so I think having people really recognize that and see those potential outcomes is really, really critical. And then thinking of okay, you want to create this experience of healthy group, you want to create a sense of belonging. What are some alternatives of ways that we could do that that don't have these XYZ outcomes? And I think talking through that and really getting to the root of what is that experience you're looking for? What are some alternatives that we could provide that through that are not hazing?
Jess, with all this, even newer education and bringing hazing into the spotlight, why does it continue to exist? I mean, would that not deter people from pursuing hazing?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's sort of the $1,000,000 question here, right? Because I think when you hear the term hazing, there is likely a shared, mostly a shared understanding that can be harmful, that is bad. Again, I think one of the biggest challenges is the lack of being able for people to be able to recognize it and define it as such, even when they're experiencing it. But Hannah touched on this. I think one of the biggest challenges that we see is this perception of a positive outcome. So even if maybe there was some negative impact along the way or some harm caused, if there was a perception that, well, now as a result, I am part of this group that I care about, or I'm part of this community that, provides other positive things for me, then it's easy to sort of dismiss what might have felt like a negative experience because there's this perception of a positive, impact or outcome. And so I think it makes it hard for students, even those who've experienced it, to then sort of, think of it as negative or to do anything, to take any action to prevent it or to stop it. And I think one of the things that I certainly experience, and this is a part of the prevention conversation, is I very often hear people who will say, how do I make sure that my student doesn't get hazed, right? Or how do I make sure my student isn't harmed? And very rarely are people saying, how do I make sure my student doesn't haze other people? Or how do I make sure my group isn't hazing people? And so, we need to really find more ways to flip that conversation, obviously, to be thinking more proactively about prevention and not just about like avoidance and response.
Well, probably one of the greatest challenges with that, Jess, is, once you're on the other side of it, you've already experienced it and it becomes tradition, right? That's part of the tradition of our organization. Because I've been through it, not me personally, but, you've been through it and the hazor. Are there any approaches that have worked to break that cycle of tradition when it comes to hazing?
Well, I'll start with one, which I think it answers, I think, one of the questions that came up in the Q&A too, about like, is all hazing bad or dangerous? And are there forms of hazing that could be positive, such as community service? And I think we would say that generally community service activities probably wouldn't be considered hazing. So there are, unless maybe there was components of it that did fit into the definition that we shared in the chat, or something about it was experienced as humiliating or degrading. But I think that key of like finding other ways for there to be ways of building community. I mean, we do this all of the time as humans, right? We become parts of communities. We build identity with folks. We build, bonds with different individuals or groups without hazing being a part of it. So how can we find different experiences, like maybe participating in community service together, or having a shared meal like every week at a certain location, or, and even ways where you maybe are relying on each other and trying to build trust in certain ways that could be, everybody takes a turn, cooking a homemade meal and bringing it on a Monday night as a way to experience share some of your culture or your home life. So just finding other things that can maybe feel personal and help build that community without there being necessarily a negative component to it. So I think community service, as an example, is one thing that we see being an effective way to do that.
No, that makes sense, Elizabeth.
Yeah, building on that, those are great examples, Jess, and looping back to Hannah's comments earlier too. I mean, I think it's really important when working with students for prevention, is to not only talk about like these potential alternatives, but how they're implemented, because pretty much anything could be hazing, like community service, study hours, having meals together. It just depends on the implementation, and how those power dynamics unfold. I mean, one thing I remember super clearly that really crystallized this for me was early on, back in the 90s and the early 2000s, when I was first getting into this work, it was very common that policies on college campuses would have a list of behaviors that, you know, would be considered hazing, and students would want to know, what can we do? What can't we do? Okay, we see the list. We can't force people to drink alcohol in order to become a member of our group. Okay. After a few years, we saw several deaths, fraternity hazing deaths due to water intoxication. So they were following the list, right? They decided they weren't going to require alcohol consumption, but instead required so much water consumption that these students had kidney failure. So, I mean, I think this is, and to put a plug in for a resource, we have, in collaboration with Clery Center, produced a film in the Diversity family. This film is called We Don't Haze, and it features the Diversity family who lost their son in a very tragic hazing incident. And it features other families as well, talking about their experiences losing children in hazing incidents. It also features students who have experienced hazing and who have implemented alternatives to hazing. And so I recommend it because it's a free resource. You can download it from either of our websites, and it's a documentary style training type tool. And it also has a facilitation guide. And in that guide, it has an exercise, an activity that can be done with groups to say, when does something cross the line? There are like case studies, and you get the students talking about, when does a certain behavior cross the line into hazing? What are those qualities or characteristics of it where we can help students understand, like, okay, a scavenger hunt might be okay in one setting, it's not hazing, but implemented in these ways, it definitely does cross the line into hazing. So I think, you know, it's really, this is why we need more than just policies. We need the conversations. We need to have the times with students to, and colleagues, to really sit down and kind of dig a little bit deeper to understand the embedded power dynamics and why hazing can be so harmful in that way.
And I would add really quick onto the, you know, with the traditions too, I think we're in a really special place right now where we're transitioning into a lot more in-person experiences, where I think it's allowed people to really reevaluate the practices that they've been doing for years. And I think in that process of reevaluation, how do we institutionalize that in our group cultures of like, okay, how do we reassess every year? Like, is this thing working for us? And I think that's allowed a lot of students and a lot of my peers to kind of challenge past traditions, because I think we're, you know, had so many things virtual and very much still in COVID, but, you know, transitioning to more in-person experiences. And it's like, okay, like we're thinking about equity, we're thinking about accessibility, we're thinking about all these new things. And so it's allowing us to challenge past traditions and past, you know, structures and systems that we've been using and thinking about, is this still serving us? Is this still working for us? And I think when we are talking about traditions, that's a great way to, I think, really naturally have those conversations with like other students of like, hey, like, let's assess this tradition. Like, I think that's becoming a lot more normalized. Is this still working for us? And then continuing to do that even beyond, you know, the transitions we're having now, like, how do we continue to do that and make that a really normal part of our experiences?
And that's really the challenge. You know, it's the whole group cultural dynamic. I know when I was in high school, our wrestling team, there were some substantial hazing involved with, especially the all the incoming freshmen, and with the coach, led by the coach, and that gets passed on from team to team, year to year, and then you look at the traditions, like you said, Hannah. It's how do you shift those traditions away from something that is destructive, right? That is destructive and has implications under the realm of hazing. So that's it's a cultural thing, and getting in there is key. Just wanted to bring a point. Elizabeth mentioned some of the resources. So for those of you that have been attending the sessions in the past, you know that after this program, you'll receive a key takeaways document in the next week with some of the things that we've been talking about today, and some additional resources for you to dive in, some actionable information for you. So our panelists will share those as well after the program, and we'll get those to you within the next week. So, all right, let's look at, we're talking about some of the causes, some of the cultural aspects. Now, from a practical perspective, and we kind of briefly touched upon this, how does one identify if somebody is involved in hazing? Is there any? Hannah kind of touched upon this briefly, but you know, from a school administration, from a parental perspective, from a roommate, a friend perspective, what can we be looking for?
Yeah. So one of the resources we can share in the follow-up is red flags. It's a one-pager, like things to look for, red flags for individuals and for the groups. And some of the things would be, you know, obviously some dramatic changes in behavior. For example, your student always keeps in touch on a regular basis, texting, calling, whatever, and then all of a sudden there's a stretch of time where there's no communication, because isolation and isolating new members is a common hazing strategy. Some things, like very obvious things, photos being posted on social media can give clues. Strange behavior, for example, I've had faculty members call and say, this student never wore a suit to class, is now coming to class every time we have a class meeting in a suit, and carrying what looks like a very heavy backpack, maybe a brick in it or something like that. That is another common hazing tactic that we've heard about. So, you know, falling asleep, excessive exhaustion, because sleep deprivation is a type of hazing. So there can be many red flags, warning signs, and they can be easily explained away by other things. And so I think it's just really important to, when you do see something, say something and talk to your student and ask what's going on, and also be aware of where you can report if you have suspicions that hazing is going on. There are often anonymous hotlines on college campuses, and if there aren't, there should be information on their campus website about who you can call to report a concern.
I mean, is hazing illegal as you know, in a general sense, or are there specific aspects of it that are not legal?
Yeah, yes. Well, hazing is illegal in many states, most states, and you can go to the Stop Hazing website and find a map that has links to each state that has a law, and read what the law, how the law is written, and to what extent there are criminal penalties and so forth. Increasingly, we're seeing stronger laws being implemented, and especially over the past few years. And so we're hearing a lot more about those laws also incorporating prevention as a mandate. And so that's new. That's a newer trend, and it's good to see. Often there are types of behaviors that occur within hazing that are covered by other laws, assault, sexual assault, and underage consumption of alcohol. There are, illegal use of drugs. There may be many other laws that could apply, but it is really important that the hazing laws are there, because often there isn't accountability for the groups that are involved in the hazing, and that's really important. that the group as well as the individuals involved are held accountable, and that there is transparency, that people know that there was some kind of accountability and consequence for what happened.
Speaking of transparency, Jess, I mean, is hazing currently covered under the Clery Act as far as reporting hazing incidents on a campus?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. So like Elizabeth said, there are certainly forms of hazing that might be covered by other Clery reportable crimes. But we have been working for some time in partnership with Stop Hazing and the Diversity family to advocate for a new bill called the REACH Act, which would make hazing in itself a Clery reportable crime, and would also put in other requirements to institutions of higher ed around how they're defining hazing, so that there could be a universal definition. As Elizabeth said, we see that as a really core part of being able to shift this conversation and move the needle when it comes to hazing, is having a better universal shared definition of what it is. You know, right now with these varied state laws and different institutional policies, we don't want it to be dependent on where you go to school of how what's going to be considered hazing and what's not. So the REACH Act includes that universal definition of hazing with those three components. It would make hazing a Clery reportable crime, meaning that the institution would need to include statistics about hazing incidents in their annual security report, and there would be requirements of your campus security authorities. And it also, perhaps most importantly, has a prevention requirement in it too, so that institutions would be required to be providing research-informed, ongoing anti-hazing education, so that we could hopefully start to increase the understanding of what it is, the negative impact of it. So we've been advocating for this bill, like I said, for a number of years. I've had really great momentum. We have over 30 national organizations who have endorsed it, and a wide range of organizations from, focus on mental health, on sexual assault, on athletics and sports. And we think that it could be one of the most meaningful ways to increase, awareness and lead to prevention. So there's a bunch of more resources on the REACH Act and ways that you can support it as well on the website.
And Jess, as a campus safety professional, but also as a mom, what would you look at when your children are considering colleges when it comes to hazing information, and what advice would you, or how would you direct them? How would you guide them based on that information?
Yeah, that's always the toughest question. My children are a little too young to be having this exact conversation with them, but I have a nephew who's looking at colleges, and I literally just this weekend tried to talk to him about this. And it's really hard because there is this sort of resistance to the idea that, of course, I won't put up with that, right? You get this initial sort of defensive response often of like, I wouldn't let anybody haze me. That's not something that I would do. And I think that there's a resistance to even consider it as something that you could experience. And so, one of my strategies is often to not call it hazing in the conversation, to talk about different behaviors or things to look for without actually categorizing it as hazing, because of, I think, the stigma around it that might really make people get defensive to it in that initial, at least young people, in that initial conversation. Another strategy that I would say is to give them some of the, talk to them about, what are you concerned about? What are some of the things that if they came up, you would feel uncomfortable with, or that might make you feel unsafe or unsure about whether you want to be a part of this. So I think just asking some questions to help them think about ahead of time, what are some of their boundaries and what are some of the things that if they did happen would be red flags for them, so that they can feel empowered, hopefully, to be able to identify and recognize some of the behaviors without it just being, a parent or somebody else saying, these are the things that are wrong, so look out for them. But helping them, try and set some of those boundaries themselves, because I think then they're much more likely to feel like they'll recognize them, or that it's something that they've already identified as something that they don't want to be a part of.
Interesting point there. It triggered, Hannah. I mean, is is hazing, we talked about the definition earlier, but is hazing, is it only physical harm, or can it be psychological harm? Like, can there be hazing that involves no drinking, no physical abuse, assault, but purely psychological?
Yeah, absolutely. There's, I would say, going back to kind of like that spectrum of hazing that ends up happening kind of the most frequently is these behaviors that fall in maybe that more psychological, mental, emotional impact. And so because they are less visible, and they're harder to identify. And I think they don't fall into what I think when we, especially from almost like a pop culture or like just from an onlooker's perspective, you have really no understanding of what hazing related behaviors look like. When you're prompted to give examples, a lot of times it falls more in that physical, drinking or something more violent and more violent behaviors. And so because most people are just not aware, I think it happens more frequently, but there's absolutely, the psychological, impacts and experiences of hazing are definitely there, and they're prevalent, in groups where there is hazing taking place.
And that seems to be obviously, part of the challenge, going back to how do you change that? How do you redirect those unhealthy group behaviors, right? So Elizabeth, so what are you talk about prevention? What are some of the most effective approaches to prevention today?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Something that we've been working really hard on in collaboration with folks at Clery and a number of other partner organizations. And we're working to conduct the research to know what is truly effective. One of the things, so until we have definitive data, one of the things we're doing is borrowing from and translating research from other areas of prevention. And so informed by public health research and prevention science, we know it's really important to approach this in a comprehensive way. So it's not going to be effective to just like, okay, we'll have a speaker come to campus and check that box and we're done. We've covered hazing prevention. Or, oh, well, we have a policy and we make sure all the students who are joining organizations read it and sign their name. All those things, both of those approaches may be helpful, but it's not enough. It's not sufficient. So we have to have a comprehensive approach. We know this from other areas. And that includes, for example, starting with building a coalition of diverse stakeholders on campus, because many times, part of the problem with, or one of the barriers of prevention is failure to see hazing, like we've talked about, like Anna just talked about, especially those types of hazing that are less visible, the harassment hazing, humiliation types of hazing. So it's training folks to see those and also to understand and recognize that they're not limited to just fraternities. And that tends to be the predominant image of hazing, is that, oh, that's something that happens in fraternities or fraternities and sororities in athletics. And we really need to expand that if we're going to do a better job with prevention. We need to expand understanding and awareness. And one way to do that is to build a coalition with diverse stakeholders who are going to help, to provide buy-in across the campus or across a school. And if you're working in a high school, same thing. Involve the coaches, but also involve advisors to the performing arts groups and the band and the honor societies or academic clubs. So involve the community, that is, families and friends of students, alums of the institution, and bring everyone in to be a part of the solution for hazing and help with prevention. So that coalition-based approach is important. And then we also know other types of strategies can be effective, including, of course, trainings. And we have some preliminary data about effectiveness, and we'll follow up with links to those, to specific trainings that have been evaluated. We know visible leadership messaging is really key. Having, whether at all levels, student leaders, mid-level leaders, presidents of the universities and colleges, getting out there and saying, this is the kind of behavior we expect to see when students are joining clubs, organizations, and the team. This is what leadership looks like. This is how it aligns with our mission as an institution. So being visible about that, having accessible information at one's fingertips through a website dedicated to hazing and hazing prevention, bystander intervention programs, social norms approach. There are many, many strategies that can be effective, but I think the key takeaway is it needs to be a comprehensive and coordinated approach, and not just one simple, annual event that we're going to check off the list.
I see the wheels turning in Jess's head. Any additional thoughts on that?
I'm just thinking, as Elizabeth is talking too, about how important it is for institutions to be transparent. And, I've worked for a long time in the field around issues of sexual violence and sexual assault, and we've seen the same tendency to want to say this isn't a problem here, this isn't a problem in our institution, and perhaps to want the numbers of instances to be low. And we've seen a real shift in the culture around that, and a recognition that actually having higher numbers reported shows that students have a better awareness of what these issues are. They know where to report it. The institutions, being transparent about it and taking accountability. And I think it's very similar with hazing. We try and send the message that senior leadership or anybody in leadership being able to recognize the problem and speak to it and show how it's being addressed is going to be much more effective than pretending like it doesn't exist. And I have heard people say, oh, it's not a problem here. We're a small school, or we don't have Greek life, so hazing's not an issue. And that's always a red flag for us. And that would be a red flag for me as a parent, that if you're hearing that, like, this is not an issue. And I would say the same thing for high schools as well. If what you're being told is this doesn't happen here, then either somebody's not telling the truth or people aren't paying enough attention.
That's all too common, whether it's hazing, other school violence. Interesting thought as you were discussing this too. I mean, have there been any approaches or considerations for? I know there's the carrot and stick approach, but more of a like an approach to provide incentives, like grants to organizations that do employ healthy group programs, initiation type programs that shift, so actually creating a financial incentive to move away from the current practices. Is that, do you know if has that been tried? I would imagine it has been, but
I've seen it on a few occasions. I haven't seen it very widespread, but on a few campuses, I've seen them incentivize providing resources for clubs and organizations who, for example, put in a proposal for an activity that would be specifically something that would build cohesion within their group, a sense of belonging, but is clearly designed to not be hazing. So something, for example, I've seen groups use that money for is to bring everyone out to the college or university's ropes course, if they have one, like the Outdoor Adventure Center, which can sometimes be cost prohibitive depending on the situation. And so having those grants helped to incentivize that type of approach.
Yeah, that'd be interesting if that model would work. We've got about 15 minutes left, so definitely want to take some questions from our attendees. If you have any questions online, go ahead and click on the Q&A button and type. We've got a bunch there I'll address in a second here. First, we have some questions that came in from the pre-registration. So Alex from the Philippine College of Criminology asks, the vast majority of fraternity-related hazing happened outside the school premises. What are the best awareness programs since they're off campus? Who wants to take that one?
So, yeah, I think this is very common with regard to hazing, that often the activities occur outside the formal boundaries of the campus. At the same time, our research shows that a sizable number of them occur right out in plain view in the public eye on campus, in classroom spaces or the student union and so forth. But to the question, I think we have a number of resources that we'll share afterwards, or you can find them on either of our websites that that provide, training, types of awareness, building workshops, and they can be video-based trainings, for example, that you can just do, share the link, expect people to watch, and that will help because they feature instances of hazing that have occurred outside of the formal campus. And so it will help to build understanding about how hazing isn't just limited to what occurs on campus. So I think those types of resources are available, and they could be effective for that situation.
Yeah, and I would also just add to look at your policy. So, your institution or your school's policy, and how both in how it's defining hazing, but what it's you might be limited sometimes in how off campus, for example, incidents might be being addressed or investigated, but that doesn't mean your policy or your student conduct process can expand beyond that. So I would say also look at how you can use your institutional or your school's policy to make sure that you're effectively capturing, hazing that could occur in different areas as well.
And I would say also too, I think a lot of the off-campus experiences, at least from my knowledge, that there's an element of surprise, I think, associated with it, or and information that's being withheld, and they don't know necessarily what they're leaving campus to go do. And I think reminding students when, you're talking about what you're looking for in a group experience, there shouldn't be really any element of surprise with your group experience. And so I think if you're being asked to leave to go do something and you don't know what that is, that's a red flag. And, I think really having those conversations proactively about that to, no information should be withheld from you about your experience. You should have access to that information, and you should know what your experiences that you're getting into are entailing. And so I think having students be able to recognize that of if I'm being asked to leave and I don't know what I'm doing, that might not be okay. And seeing that as a red flag too.
We have a question here from Jamie from FSU. I often get asked when a faculty advisor advises a group, what is the level of liability of them if a death or a crime is involved? So who's liable?
Yeah, it ranges. I mean, and it's sometimes hard to find out. The specifics aren't always public. But we do know that people have been held liable, from the students involved to university officials or others who were or the institution itself, or others who may have been involved. Whether it was a coach or advisor. So I don't have any specific numbers to share, but I think it is something to be honest about with your faculty advisors or your staff advisors. And that's an area where we see enormous potential for growth, is having more formalized trainings for faculty and staff who are serving in those roles. Because if they are more aware of some of the things we've been talking about, of the potential red flags, of how to access resources that would prevent hazing from occurring to begin with by promoting the behaviors we want to see, positive belonging and leadership, for example, then they're going to be far less at risk of liability or being involved in any kind of hazing situation.
Yeah, because that seems, and Alejandro asks on the Q&A as well about, the potential. I mean, are there opportunities for increasing the criminal liability of suspects facing homicide charges if there's a fatal instance of hazing? I mean, is that so? On the one we're talking about, potentially like having incentives, and on the other side, making the issues, even the criminal aspects, even more severe to the organization as well as to the individuals. Thoughts on that, Hannah?
Well,
or Jess?
Sorry. Yeah, I'll jump in quickly. I think again, it is going to be really dependent on the state laws. But I know one of the things that I've heard from working with the diversity family, who we were saying whose son died from hazing 15 years ago at Ryder. They talk a lot about how the law enforcement that arrived on the scene immediately started investigating it as a hazing incident, and how uncommon that was at that time, especially, and how much of a difference that made then in the investigation of the case and the evidence that was gathered and the way that the investigation proceeded, because often these cases are initially not being treated as a hazing incident or a part of hazing, and are being seen as maybe drinking, an individual drinking too much, etc. And so it really changes the course of the investigation. It changes who they're talking to. It changes everything. I know we don't have anyone specifically in law enforcement to address that, but I think that is something that, we've pushed for, and I think we've seen some positive change around, is law enforcement, particularly in campus safety officials, being better trained on how to recognize hazing from the beginning, so that if they are stepping into a scene, whether there was, harm or a death, that they are immediately able to look for clues and evidence that this was part of a hazing, a series of hazing incidents.
Excuse me. Stephanie Wright, thanks you, Jessica and Elizabeth. Stephanie, and this I'll direct to Hannah, because I think we have touched upon this, but she asked, are there programs for educating seniors in high school or freshmen in college campuses about hazing or part of orientation? Is it part of orientation?
I think that's something that with the REACH Act that they're really trying to do, is to kind of create these prevention, efforts really embedded into all institutions' approaches. And I think that, to my knowledge, I don't think that's something that's necessarily a part of all universities' orientation processes or new student programs. I think it's something that should be. And I think where, especially like from a student leader perspective, I think that that's something that when, you're bringing in new members to an organization or to a group, and that should be something that is an educational component of that onboarding process, and resources should be shared. But to my knowledge, I don't know what those programs currently look like, or if they're available. I think that's definitely a room for growth area.
Elizabeth, what have you found or experienced?
Yeah, I think it does really vary, and I don't think it is necessarily the norm for hazing to be included in those orientation programs, except to share that there is a policy, for instance. Although there are a number of campus professionals that we've worked with and continuing to work with that are incorporating it, making concerted efforts to integrate hazing prevention within already established induction processes like orientation, for example, new student orientation. And so rather than adding another whole, layer of like, everyone's going to have to also do this hazing prevention education, integrate it into efforts that already exist. There's so many intersections, and we're talking about student mental health. We're talking about wellness. We're talking about leadership. All those things are connected. And it's great opportunity to incorporate hazing prevention into any of those conversations.
Should the focus be, or is the focus on individuals training and changing their perspectives, or the organizations themselves, whether the fraternal organizations or clubs or the organizations that do that? Is there an effort on trying to transform the organizational cultural aspects? Is that happening right now?
In some cases, yes. It has to be all of the above. I mean, it has to be all the different layers of the environment. So we have to work to build skills for the individuals, like we've been talking about, helping students become more aware of their boundaries and the red flags. At the same time, we have to help student leaders to know how to create that sense of belonging, how to lead in ethical ways and ways that promote positive sense of inclusion and don't compromise their peers' mental health and or physical health. And then beyond that, we have to look at the institution, the larger campus culture and climate, because there are many aspects there that could either lay a groundwork, make it more likely for hazing to occur, and or make it less likely for hazing to occur. So, and beyond that, we've got, the earlier experiences in high school and outside of high school and other kinds of groups, information and messaging from families and friends. So it's all those things matter, and we're working at all those levels to create more effective interventions and primary prevention.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Nanette asks, are there organizations addressing what students can immediately do if they see a student in crisis as a result of a hazing event?
Yeah,
you mentioned see something, say something. Is there more than that? Or?
Well, I'll just start us off, and Jess and Hannah, feel free to jump in. I mean, I think if you see a student in crisis and you're pretty sure it's a hazing situation, I think most importantly is to ensure their safety. How can you, work with them to get the resources and support they need to be sure they're both physically and mentally, feeling psychically safe. And then from there, ensuring that they're not feeling a sense of re-victimization by having power taken away from them and decisions made for them. So keeping them involved in the process of decision-making about what happens next, being aware of the resources and the different trusted campus professionals and advocates that may be available in a school or a college campus.
Jess?
Yeah, I think a common terminology that you'll hear is bystander intervention, right? And it's often used in regards to thinking about sexual violence, sexual harassment, but it really applies to other forms of harassment and abuse and applies to hazing. And it's something that I think there's been a lot more momentum around of, again, like empowering students to be the ones to speak up if they see or hear something harmful. Definitely if there is a student in crisis, knowing what the resources are. And really what we see as a really key component of that is them trusting that they can contact somebody for help and that they'll get the help that they need and that they won't necessarily, they won't get in trouble or they won't feel penalized for reaching out. And so, we work with institutions in particular to make sure that they have amnesty policies, to make sure that they are actively building those relationships with students. So there is trust and there is a degree of feeling like if I hear something or I see something, I know what to do with that information. I know who to call, and I trust that it's going to be taken seriously. And that it's not going to end up, be harmful for me. And again, we want to be building those bridges so that students do feel like they know who to get that support from.
No doubt. And unfortunately, we're running out of time here, so I have some more questions. But to be respectful of everyone's time, we'll wrap things up. But before I do want to hear, just if you have any final thoughts, we'll start with Hannah. Any final thoughts for our participants today on preventing hazing?
Yeah. I mean, my really big thing, and I just think just because, being a student leader and working with a lot of student leaders, I think really, really engaging your student leaders proactively and having them, I think creating a culture of thinking about not just your own organization, but also, what is the community that you're a part of? I think that goes back to the bystander intervention. I think really empowering people to create a community of care where if they see something happening in other organizations, they're still, because there is that mentality of like, oh, it's not happening in my organization. It's not happening here. It's not happening in my group. And I think really empowering student leaders to understand the way that they can help contribute to taking care of other community members and kind of engage and have these conversations within their own organizations and really create a culture of values-based leadership and understanding what are my values as an organization and how to we strip everything away. We start from what our values are, and then we build out all of our experiences from there. That should be really the core foundation. And so I think really engaging student leaders, creating buy-in, that's where, so much change happens because the more that they feel like they're a part of that change, the more they're going to be interested and want to make a difference and feel more comfortable and confident in calling out what they're seeing and making changes that really impact group culture. So. Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Hannah. Elizabeth, final thoughts for our participants.
Well, ditto to that. Thank you, Hannah. I just want to thank everyone for taking the time to be here and to care. And I guess my final thought would be everyone can make a difference, and we need everyone to make a difference on this issue. And so I hope that you leave today with more ideas and resources for how you can take action after this.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Jess, any final thoughts?
I thank you all for being here and for seeing this as a priority. I think if you're making the time to be here, then you obviously recognize this as a problem already. There are so many resources that are there already, free resources that we want you to be using and accessing. So please do. And I'll just one more time plug the work that we're doing to try and get the REACH Act passed and to encourage you to look into that too and to add your name as a supporter of that if you believe in it, because we do think that that sort of federal legislation is going to be key to prevention.
Absolutely. And just wanted to thank everyone for attending today. The big theme that I think kept on resurfacing and all over my notes here is culture. And that's really the what we really need to focus on and to employ approaches that will help prevent hazing. And it's not just one thing, it's an entire holistic approach. Want to remind folks that our next sessions is the Future of Emergency Notification Systems. That's May 24th at 2 p.m. After that, we're talking about surveillance technology, surveillance systems. And then we're going to be talking about the future of campus law enforcement. We'll be at IACLEA in Las Vegas. We'll be doing sessions from there. Once again, if you're interested in becoming a member of ZeroNow, please go to zeronow.org, click on the join button. More information is there. And we appreciate you taking the time, and we'll see you all soon. Thanks, panelists. Appreciate it. Thanks, Hannah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.